The courtroom scene is often the one that is most cited for To Kill a Mockingbird. People look at the book and they think, well, it's all about the courtroom. The problem is the court scene is only about 3 chapters of the entire book, and it really only serves as a pinnacle example of what's going on throughout the rest of the book, and it really highlights just the prejudice and lack of education that the culture as a whole maintains. And so what we're going to do for this section is go through the court scenes, and I want to point out a couple of different themes that we have already been tracking. One being the I guess the caste system within their cultural classes. And then the second thing that I wanted to look at has to do with um, maturity. The third being racism, or just the isms in general, ageism, feminism, and alcoholism. That's one we haven't exactly talked about, but and it doesn't quite fit into that same category. But again, let's go ahead and start looking at those. So we have chapter 17. It begins, Jen, those are the Yules sitting down yonder. Hush, said Jen. Mr. Hectate's testifying. Mr. Hectate, dressed in for the occasion, he wore ordinary business suit, which made him look somehow like every other man. Gone were his boots, lumber jacket, and bullet-studded belt. From the moment he ceased to terrify me, he was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hands clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor. So in your own words, Mr. Tate, Mr. Gilmer said. Well, I was called. Could you say it to the jury, Mr. Tate? Thank you. Who called you? Well, I was fetched by Mr. Bob Yule yonder one night. What night, sir? It was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Yule came in, very excited he was, and said, get out of his house quickly. Some guy raped his girl. Did you go? Certainly. Got in the car and went out as fast as I could. And what did you find? I found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I have heaved her to her feet, and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner and said she was all right, and I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson. Judge Taylor, who'd been concentrating on his fingernails, looked as if he were expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. I asked her if he beat her up like that, and she said yes, he had. I asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to the Robinsons' house, and I brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in, and that's all there was to it. Thank you, said Mr. Gilmer. Any questions, Atticus? Yes, said my father. He was sitting behind his table. His chair was skewed to one side. Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anybody call a doctor? Asked Atticus. No, sir, said Mr. Tate. Didn't call a doctor? No, sir, repeated Mr. Tate. Why not? There was an edge to Atticus's voice. Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something should have happened, and it was obvious. But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anyone send for one, or fetch one, or carry her to one? No, sir. Judge Taylor broke in. He's answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor. Atticus said, I just wanted to make sure, Judge. And the judge smiled. Jem's hand tightened around the balcony rail, and he drew in his breath suddenly. What is it? I whispered. Shh. Sheriff, Atticus was saying, you say she was mighty banged up. In what way? Well, describe her injuries, Heck. Well, she was beaten around the head. There were bruises coming on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before. How do you know? Well, sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye coming. Which eye? Let's see. Mr. Tate blinked and said softly, well, can't you remember? Atticus said. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front and said, her left. Wait a minute, Sheriff, said Atticus. Was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way you were? Mr. Tate said, oh, yes, that would make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch, I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face. Mr. Tate blinked again. As if by instinct, Tom Robinson raised his head. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. No. Atticus walked up and bent down to the furiously scribbling hand, and it stopped and flipped back to the shorthand pad. Mr. Finch, I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face. Atticus looked at Mr. Tate. Which side again, Heck? The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about them? Yes. What were her other injuries? Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. All around her throat, at the back of her neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. Just answer the question yes or no, please, Sheriff, said Atticus dryly. Below us, heads turned and feet scraped. People whispered softly. With his infinite capacity for calming turbulent seas, he could make rape case as dry as a sermon. Gone was the terror in my mind of stale whiskey and barnyard smells and sleepy-eyed sullen men. Mr. Finch, they gone? Our nightmare had gone with the daylight. His mouth was twisted in a purposeful half-grin, and his eyes happy, and he said something about corroborating evidence, which made sure he was showing off Robert E. Lee Ewell. In answer, that's also a funny reference. If you know who Robert E. Lee is, I'll leave you to that. Why would Mr. Ewell be named after him, and kind of what is the symbolism there? A little bantam cock of a man rose, and he strutted to the stand. The back of his neck was reddening at the sound of his name. We saw no resemblance to his namesake, and a shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. So help me God, he crowed. Every town the size of Macomb had families like the Ewells. No economic fluctuation changed their status. People like them lived as guests of the county. No truant officers could keep their numerous offspring in school. Macomb's Ewells lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat. Its only shape suggested the original design. It was square, with 4 tiny rooms opening onto a shotgun hall. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls, which in the summertime were covered with greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep the varmints that feasted on Macomb's refuse. The varmints had lean time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough gleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made a plot of ground along the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. What passed for a fence were bits of tree limbs and broomsticks and tool shafts, all ripped with rusty hammerheads. Snaggletooth rake handles, shovels, axes, and grubbing hoses held on pieces of barbed wires, and enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remains of a Model T on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, an ancient ice box, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, fruit jars, scrawny orange chickens. One corner of the yard, though bewildered Macomb, against the fence, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars, holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they had belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson. People said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place, and some people said 6, others said 9. There were several dirty-faced ones at the windows whenever anyone passed, and nobody had occasion to pass by except at Christmas when the churches delivered baskets, and the mayor asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping out our own trees and trash. Mr. Robert Ewell, asked Mr. Gilmer. That's my name, Captain, said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and he felt sorry for him. Perhaps I'd better explain something now. I've heard lawyers' children, on seeing their parents in court in the heat of an argument, get the wrong idea. They think opposing counsel to be the personal enemy of their parents, and they suffer agony, and they're surprised to see them go out arm in arm. Well, we acquired no trauma from watching our father win or lose. We could tell that when debate became more acrimonious than professional, but this was from watching lawyers other than our father. I never heard Atticus raise his voice in my life, except at a deaf witness. Mr. Gilmer was just doing his job, and Atticus was doing his. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Yes. Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her mama's dead, was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred, and he turned slowly. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? He asked. Yes, sir, Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. This the first time you ever been in court? I don't recall ever seeing you here. At the witness' affirmative nod, he continued, well, let's get one thing straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom. Do you understand? Mr. Ewell nodded. Judge Taylor sighed. All right, Mr. Gilmer. Thank you, sir, Mr. Ewell. Would you tell us in your words what happened on the evening of November 21st, please? Jem grinned. Mr. Gilmer was afraid his witness might employ, well, the night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods. Oops, where did that go? I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a struck hog inside the house. Judge Taylor glanced sharply at the witness. What time was it, Mr. Ewell? Just 'fore sundown. Well, I was saying Mayella was screaming fit to be Jesus, and Another glance from the bench silenced him. Yes, she was screaming, said Mr. Gilmer. Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and run as fast as I could. But I run into the fence. When I got disentangled, I run up to the window and I seen... His face grew scarlet, and he pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. I seen that black man yonder ruttin' on my Mayella. So serene was the court that he had few occasions to use his gravel, but he hammered fully 5 times, because behind us there was an angry muffled groan, and the whole county stood in the middle of the aisle, quelling the packed courtroom. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and me. Mr. Jen, you better take Miss Jean Louise home. Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home. You gotta make me first. I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it. I most certainly do. I can understand anything you said. Ah, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet. Mr. Finch know y'all are here? That ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise or you boys either. Well, he can't see us. It's all right, Reverend. I knew Jim would win, 'cause I knew nothing could make him leave now. Also, what power does Reverend Sykes have over a white boy? None. So he can't make him leave. He can only suggest it. There has been a request, said Judge Taylor, that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, at least of women and children, that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for, and what they hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you of one thing, you will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. But you won't leave it until the whole boiling of you come before me on contempt charges. Mr. Ewell, you will keep your testimony within the confines of Christian English usage, if that's possible. Proceed. Mr. Gilmer. Well, Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter? Yes, I did. The spectators were quiet, and Atticus whispered to him, and Tom Robinson was silent. You say you were at the window? Asked Mr. Gilmer. Yes, sir. How far is it from the ground? About 3 foot. Did you have a clear view of the room? Yes, sir. How'd the room look? It was all slung about like there was a fight. And what did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I run around the house to get in, but he run out the front door just ahead of me, and I saw who he was all right. I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor, squalling. Then what'd you do? I run for Tate, quick as I could. I know who it was. All right, it lived down yonder in that nest, past the house every day. Judge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest on yonder. They're dangerous to live around, besides devouring my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell, said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. Just a minute, sir, said Atticus. Could I ask you a question or two? Mr. Ewell backed up into the witness chair and settled himself. He regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion. Mr. Ewell, said Atticus, folks are doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran to the house, you ran to the window, you ran inside, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this time, run for a doctor? Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened. But there's one thing I don't understand. Weren't you concerned about Mayella's condition? Well, I most positively was. I seen who done it. No, I mean her physical condition. Didn't you think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention? What? Well, didn't you think she should have a doctor immediately? The witness had never thought of it. He never called a doctor or anyone to in his life. Cost him $5. That all? He asked. Not quite, said Atticus. Mr. Ewell, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you? How's that? Well, you were in the courtroom. Mr. Heck Tate was on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you? Mr. Ewell considered the matter carefully. Yes. Did you agree with his description of Mayella's injuries? Well, how's that? Mr. Ewell seemed determined not to give the defense the time of day. Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened and that she was beaten around the... Oh, yeah, I hold with everything Tate said. You do. I just want to make sure, he went on. Which eye? Was it her left? Oh, yes, that'd make it her right if it was her right eye. Mr. Finch, I remember now. She was bunged. He flipped the page. Up on that side of the face, Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye. I said, thank you, Bert, said Atticus. You heard it again. Mr. Ewell, do you have anything to add? Do you agree with the sheriff? I holds with Tate. Her eye was blackened and she was mighty beat up. The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation on the bench. It was becoming evident that he thought Atticus was an easy match, and he seemed to glow again. His chest swelled. He was a little red rooster. I thought he was going to burst. Mr. Ewell, can you read and write? Mr. Gilmer interrupted. Objection. I can't see what the witness literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant and immaterial. Judge, if you'll allow me to question, plus another one, you'll see. All right, let's see, said Judge Taylor, but make sure we can see, Atticus. Overruled. We'll continue in the next section.